That's perfect. So we're going to start in a couple of minutes. Just a couple of announcements before we start. I will be recording the first part, so just Dan and Ian's talk, and then I'll stop recording before the Q&A. But don't worry, you won't be included in the. So if any other people don't want to be included in the presentation, they won't be either their photos or their audio. So there'll be a Q&A later after 11. So there'll be an hour of talk, then 4 minutes or so of break, and then an hour of Q&A. The Q&A will be traditional. In the first part, if any one of you should have a clarificatory question, please do this. Write up the question in the chat briefly, and then I'll have a look at it. And if it is clarificatory, then I'll ask you to ask the question, or if you prefer, I can read the question for you. That's how the clarificatory questions will go. But then the rest, the second hour will be traditional Q&A with the Zoom hand function thingy. Right. Okay. So yeah. Right. Okay. So let's start. I have the great pleasure to introduce Dan Hutto and Ian Robertson, both from the University of Wollongong in Australia. And they will be talking about philosophy of emotions. And the new title is A New Better Bet, Rescuing and Revising Basic Emotion Theory. Please, Dan and Ian, you can start.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having us. So this talk is going to be based on paper we have out in Frontiers. It was Michael Kirchhoff was on the talk as well. Was on the paper as well. Okay, so start by having a little quick summary of the core tenets of the more standard, or what we call the original, basic emotion theories. So Bett conjectures that there are a core set of emotions which are best identified with and instantiated by biologically evolved and pan-cultural affect programs. So Bett understands emotions as affect programs and takes them to unfold without anything like conscious attention or direction in coordinated yet automatic script-like patterns. So, you know, heartbeat elevation, respiratory, neural patterns, etc. And Ekman has now been working for a number of years on micro expressions in facial features and how they're interpreted. So in short, its big idea is that basic emotions manifest as a kind of distinctive mosaic of physiological, autonomic, neural, behavioral, and expressive organismic responses. Now, the other day, I decided to just sort of give a Google to the term basic emotions, right, and to see what came up. This notion that there are, following Ekman, this notion that there are 6 basic emotions has really come into sort of something like consensus within affective science, and it's very popularized still. You know, we can see the 6 types of basic emotions here. That was merely 5 months ago, 6 basic emotions. This was April of this year, 6 types of basic human emotion and their effect on human behavior. Also, I mean, there's a good deal of research sort of trying to link sort of basic emotions to animal lives as well. So other bets or other key tenets that bettors often subscribe to. So some bettors take it the non-basic emotions are comprised of a kind of intricate complex of different basic emotions. Others associate basic emotions with broadly system one thinking. So obviously most of you will be familiar with the idea that thinking is possibly constructed, it's in some sense unfolds through two distinct systems of thought, one very quick and automatic, and the other more conscious and reflective. Now, some researchers, nonetheless, despite its widespread acceptance, some bet against bet, as it were, and think that we ought to dispense with the notion or the distinction between basic and non-basic emotional profiles. Colin Betty is one such researcher. Now, she maintains that all bets are problematic. The bet has promoted, as far as she's concerned, a counterproductive conviction among researchers in affective science that emotions divide into two distinct and mutually exclusive classes. Moreover, she claims that in getting rid of, in dispensing with the in the distinction between basic and non-basic, we would eliminate the need to explain how alleged basic emotions relate to non-basic ones. The fundamental problem with that, as far as Colin Betty is concerned, is that the adherence to it promotes belief in a distorting taxonomy. Some emotions are deemed to possess distinctive pan-cultural response profiles, and other emotions are deemed to be entirely culture-bound and lacking in such distinctive response profiles. So we have two, as it were, distinct forms of emotion, and sort of never the twain shall meet. Colin Betty's analysis, the belief that has been allowed to congeal in affective science, that researchers have already identified the core set of basic emotions, Ekman's so-called Big Six, lends credence to the idea that Bett's basic, non-basic distinction is empirically well established. Said belief, in turn, fuels blinkered and self-perpetuating research programs. The allegedly unfounded belief in the basic, non-basic distinction is itself reinforced in the field because effective researchers focus on only a very limited subset of emotions, never seek to disconfirm it, namely Ekman's six. So Colin Betty traces the source of the putative trouble here with the original bet to the influence of the seminal study of Ekman and Friesen. Now, Ekman and Friesen sought to determine whether some facial expressions would be identified as displaying the same emotions in both literate and non-literate cultures. So, I mean, Ekman was throughout the 60s trying to establish whether, through displaying a photograph interpretation, whether certain emotions were pan-cultural. But one criticism that was pervasive was, well, have you gone to non-literate countries, and if not, how can you establish that these are not culturally inherited? So Colin Betty emphasizes that the process by which these six emotions were chosen was entirely arbitrary, or at least contained a lot of arbitrariness. Merely practical considerations drove Ekman and Friesen to focus on the six emotions that they did, rather than investigating a wider array of potential candidates. And this is true. They chose, and they're open about it in the paper, in subsequent discussions of the paper. They chose the potential emotions, the candidate emotions that they did, precisely because they could not obtain sufficient sample photographs to investigate the broader set that they wanted to. So just, I mean, obviously deciding which emotions are basic by any such selection process is going to be arbitrary. So with that being said, Colombetti's chief complaint with BET is a methodological one. The assumption that some emotions are basic and others non-basic has led to those deemed non-basic being less studied. As such, there has developed a dearth of evidence for assessing whether emotions deemed non-basic in fact have non-basic in fact have basic profiles. Colombetti, for instance, tells us that the slight zoom complications. Tells us that the conviction that emotions such as jealousy, shame, envy, love, and so on are not basic and thus do not have distinctive manifestations has discouraged the study of their neural, behavioral, and bodily features. For these reasons, she maintains that BET is not empirically well established, but merely widely presupposed. BET has acquired a life of its own, she says, and the received view in effective science today is that only some emotions are basic. Colombetti's right, then only an arbitrary subclass, not the entire class of emotions, is being systematically investigated to determine whether emotions have a basic profile. So she doesn't hold any punches here. She says effective scientists would be better off if they dispensed with BET, if they dropped BET entirely. So she's very clear about this. This is a very ambitious claim. Despite its being something like the status quo, despite its influence, it needs to go. BET needs to cease. Now, one example of a neglected emotion that she does play up is that of love. Back in 1996, Shaver and colleagues concurred with her. They wrote, love received less attention from emotion researchers than its place in everyday life would lead one to expect. Now, perhaps this was true 20 years ago. Perhaps love was a neglected target of investigation 20 years ago. But even if this proves true, it would be hard to argue that the same holds true of today's effective science. Graham, for instance, provides a meta-analysis of higher order factors underlying the most popular measures of love, reviewing 81 studies that analyze data from 103 samples, 20,000 individuals, and we have other examples in the paper of such large meta-analyses. So, effective scientists then, in line with Ekman's years-long insistence that many, if not all, emotions could indeed be basic, seem at least to be more actively exploring emotions beyond the Ekman Big Six. And even Colombetti acknowledges that what she regards as a BET-induced negative trend in the effective sciences is changing, albeit slowly. So here's the thing. Here's where we have some doubts about Colombetti. Even if we were to accept Colombetti's assessment of the current state of effective science, BET's proponents may simply allow that the investigatory scope of effective research needs to be widened. In any case, emotion scientists, it seems, are already appropriately widening their focus beyond an allegedly arbitrary subdivision of emotions. So already they are well in the process of moving beyond the Ekman Six. And if they're not, they should be. In any case, if there is any legitimate worry about BET, it can't primarily be that it has bad methodological effects on emotion research, since this begs an important question about whether any BET will prove to be a good BET. Colin-Betty's observation about the state of effective science then provides, we submit, no reason to abandon the basic and non-basic distinction. In order to undermine said distinction, it would have to be demonstrated, we think, that either that all emotions have a basic profile or that none do, or that in some sense can't be determined. Now, one other researcher who does make such criticism of that, who we'll now turn to focus on, is Rebecca Hoefendijk. Hoefendijk claims that further research is likely to reveal only very vague and gradual features to differentiate between basic and non-basic emotions. As such, we might think that effective science is better off classifying emotions across a gradual spectrum, whereupon some may be evolutionarily older or more hardwired or less sensitive to social context than others. So as it were, she is betting against that. Now, even if we can order emotions across such a continuum of, say, their evolutionary age, susceptibility to change under social influences or whatnot, there may still be very good reasons to draw a firm and scientifically tractable distinction between basic and non-basic emotions. And this is where I'm going to turn over to Dan, and he's going to flesh out our way of, we think, one way of distinguishing between basic and non-basic emotions under the guise of radical inactivism. So I'll just I'll terminate my part here. There we are.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Ian. Let me share my screen. And there we go. Can everybody hear me? Can anybody hear me? Just so I know.
Yes.
Yep. Good.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So I'll get cracking. So we've heard already, thank you, Ian, about the backdrop and the criticisms and the recent attempts to shelve BET or provide arguments against it. What we want to motivate here, and I'll be upfront about this, is some philosophical reasons for wanting to keep the distinction in place, which I think would have impact on the empirical, but they're not, as we were seeing there, wholly empirical. So this isn't just about determining whether or not something has the profile of a basic emotion as it's been understood in that literature, as the scientists might, detailing it and then going out on a safari hunt to locate those emotions. And we'll see why I think that's important. And so there is a dimension here for those listening, in which if you could find a way to destabilize our distinction, our philosophically based distinction, you might find reason to make arguments against us. But our arguments here are not based entirely on some kind of location of empirical profile or the reportage of empirical data. So you'll see why that's the case. But in any case, I want to defend what I would call perhaps a new, better bet that interfaces with that older notion. So we are basically defending the idea that there is merit in distinguishing basic and non-basic emotions, and hence subscribing to some kind of bet. I want to be upfront about this too, that in doing so does not require us to endorse any of the original bets per se, although we will, and with some suggested modifications, retain some of the core ideas of those notions. We think that those adjustments wouldn't take us too far away from, say, let's go back to Ekman, who we'll return to by the end, but there will be some significant upgrades in our understanding before the finish. Okay, so we will connect this up to work that I've been pursuing on my own with well, actually with a large body of others in different formats, but principally here, some of the canonical statements come from the work that I've done alongside Eric Meehan, which is the advancement of what we call a radically inactive account of cognition. The key ideas in this, and we can take up more details and questions, is that REC, as we like to call it, assumes that cognition is not uniform. It doesn't always and everywhere involve or entail representational content. And the root forms of cognition are taken on this account to be extensively relational and interactive, but not content involving. Now, that's been a controversial thesis. It's gained more support over the years than one might have supposed, I guess, when we were first pushing it out. And there are other inactivists, including some like Colombetti, and other inactivists like Thompson, or even figures like Noe, who would embrace some aspects of this, but not all of it. So there's a lot of internal family debates between inactivists over this. But this is the core position, and this figures into the account of the emotions and why we want to establish a basic, non-basic distinction. So this would be our principal basis for drawing that distinction. This, I think, ties in with the work of a number of philosophers who, working quite independently of the notion of radical inactivism, but who nonetheless are committed to drawing a distinction between two types of emotions in the literature. So go back to Goldie in 2000, he claims that affect programs do provide what he calls, quote, a good characterization of some short-term episodes of emotional experience involved in the recognition response tie, which could be a suitable object of study for evolutionary science. If I had more time to, speak about Goldie's position, or people may want to pick me up on that later, he introduces a notion of feeling towards in his account, which he's quite clear is distinct from the full-blown notions of propositional attitudes or contentful attitudes that is usually associated with more sophisticated, culturally based understandings of emotion. And so he makes a clear division with respect to that property and basic emotions here defined by affect programs, and the sort of thing that he sees as more narratively based ways of thinking about the emotions. So he also acknowledges, is the point, that culture makes an important difference in the shaping of our emotional responses in ways that are locally deemed to be appropriate and proportional. So there's special culturally based ways of thinking, narratively based ways that connect us to, that are more characteristic of the emotional lives of human beings. All right. So we have here that split between something more basic and something more culture bound. And in a similar kind of discussion, we find Paul Griffiths making this kind of claim. He says it's plausible that our adult human anger has something deeply in common with anger in frustrated infants, or the anger of a dominant monkey towards a subordinate. Either of these agents possess the relevant concepts, he thinks, on some standard conceptions, or they are not angry in the true sense of the word. This is not a position that, by the way, Griffiths is endorsing, just describing. So that conditional, that if you say this, then you want to say, well, what's this deep notion of anger that is held in common? He wants to say that either they have the full-fledged sets of concepts that enable them to think about, reflect on these emotions, or they would have some kind of only mere analogous form of emotion. He says this problem is made worse by evidence that emotions in adult humans can be produced by low-level processes that seem equally implausible locales for such concepts. And so the issue here is, in defending the idea that there might be some grounds for thinking of analogs in animals as basic, and in some sense, even those in our own repertoire of response as quite basic, he's recognizing that, again, that there seems to be two forms of ways of thinking about emotions. In the paper, which we won't do here, but we can take up it in concepts, in questions, we do discuss different ways of carving this out. So that this is likely to provoke amongst philosophers, as we've seen in other domains, debates about which of these emotions is the bona fide kind of emotion. And that's one of the things that the story that we want to tell about emotions seeks to overcome, that we shouldn't have to make a choice between these more basic forms and these more content involving forms. So what is the position that we want to take on this? Well, it's very simply or broadly this in a nutshell. Thanks to our evolutionary histories, both we and many other creatures are naturally set up to be set off by certain types of things and situations as opposed to others. This is the crudest breakdown of the position we have, we would like to advance. And such basic emotional modes of response can become tied up with content involving in norm-influenced modes of emotional responding. That's certainly the case, at least securely we know that's the case in human beings, and we're not saying it's impossible for other animals, but we certainly know that is so with us. And what we want to say is that both basic and these more culturally influenced modes of emoting are recognizably familiar. Hence the whole literature on this in the philosophical world. We have, we can raise questions about whether basic emotions count as emotions at all and vice versa. And those debates are quite lively. So what we want to suggest too is that the way to think about this, a pivotally important way to think about this, contra the idea of two mutually separate classes with entirely different properties. And I will stress that if we go back to the Columbetty quote, you'll recall that it's by thinking that these are entirely separate ways of responding. One is automatic and the other is culture bound, and that the twain shall not meet, as Ian put it, that we get the idea that we have something quite distinct. Our way of understanding this is something more along the lines of the idea that we might think of basic emotions as something like Coke Zero, and that Coca-Cola, with the addition of just the addition of sugar in the mix, gives an extra ingredient that dynamically changes what we've got. So it's not so easy to filter it out, but it also means for purposes of doing empirical investigations, that if we should investigate a new series of emotions, we won't be able to determine empirically, just by looking at them, whether they have a purely basic profile, because on our account, it's possible for someone to have some instances in which they respond, or in some conditions which they respond in basic ways to another, exhibiting what we might call a basic, very characteristic, basic anger profile, yet and also be able to respond in other cases, or when they get a better of themselves, in more sophisticated ways too. So it's not going to be a straightforward attempt to just isolate. If one just goes out to investigate this and you discover that the love, for example, also has some basic properties, in some instances, you won't necessarily know that it doesn't also have a sophisticated manifestation, and vice versa. So if this is the right way to think about this distinction, it raises a lot of questions about the empirical work and those debates that we were hearing about earlier. Okay. So to reiterate, the idea that's being suggested here is that we shouldn't have a singular way of thinking about emotions that goes across the board. So that would be a kind of attempt to work with Hoofendijk's gradualist position, so that all emotions in some way or another are along simple continuum. We think that there is a dividing line and that the special ingredient makes a significant difference, not a metaphysically vast difference of different kinds in that sense, but to borrow from Tim Crane from some years ago, we might want to say that sometimes when we're making claims about differences of kind, we're really just saying there's a significance of such a degree that it warrants speaking of a change in kind. And in this case, we're talking about the introduction of very specific elements atop the more basic ones. So those would be culturally driven. So if we were to diagram this, there's two positions that we particularly want to resist with respect to the content question. And that is what we, in other writings I've described, is the view that an unrestricted claim that all cognition involves content, unrestricted kick, which would say that even the most basic emotions must be fully contentful. And another position, which is closer to say that of Colin Betty's and some other inactivists, would be that we call really radical inactivism. Other people like DiPaolo have also pushed this position, which is to say there's just a continuity here where we don't expect to find representational content at the core of emotions anywhere along the spectrum, including a different way of understanding language and other properties as purely non-representational. And the position that we're advocating is to say, if you adopt the radically inactive position on cognition, as before, we don't expect uniformity across the board. So we do think that the introduction of certain capacities that come along with content involving thinking enables a person or a creature to reflect on things, that changes the dimensions, that changes their ability to express and respond to emotional situations, that modulates basic emotions in some cases, not in all cases. And this is the position that we're defending. So one thing that falls out of that is that Reck's diachronic explanation of the origins of non-basic emotions is kinky, which is to say, it isn't a simple tale of a mere elaboration of existing forms. So it's not just a simple continuum story in that sense. Non-basic emotions are not just more complex versions of basic emotions. Reck proposes a multi-story story, one that stars social cultural platforms, constructions, norms, and influences as introducing extra cognitive ingredients, or even better, I should say, to be more clear, putting it in slightly non-logical terms so we don't get confused, extra cognitive capacities. So what we see this is a capacity-based story. New capacities come into play when you have new ingredients in the mix. Okay. So instead of a simple linear story that suggests, even though there's a continuum, we just find differences along a straight line, we think that there is a significant change, a significant upgrade in the possibility of emotion, response, and expression that comes from the introduction of these contentful capacities to think and describe ourselves contentfully, or reflect in terms of our lives narratively and such like. Okay. So Reck's tale of the rise of non-basic emoting involves cognitive niches and how they scaffold and introduce novel cognitive features and capacities. So that's a response to the reduced explanatory burden that would come if we were to dissolve the distinction, as Colin Betty had suggested. We think that the reasons to do justice to the rich phenomena of emotional experience requires us to make this distinction, and then we are, of course, and she's entirely right, burdened with the task of making these explanations, but we think that's at least possible. Enculturating our emotions introduces, as I said, something genuinely new into the cognitive mix. It's not just more of the same, but it does not take away or erase what was already there. So it's possible, as I said, to respond in what we might describe as basic ways with a basic profile under some circumstances. And that does, I think, happen. So this is why when we think that there's not just one way that we manifest anger and that we can learn to quote unquote control or modulate our emotions, that's also a way of taking a grip of those more basic scripts. Or sometimes one has to put the control after the response. So there's any number of ways that we might think of the way that those emotions get manifested, depending on one's abilities and how one has trained oneself to respond in certain cases. So enculturated emoters come to emote in wholly novel ways, as well as in the tried and tested ones that have been around evolutionarily, foundationally, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. Okay, we won't have time to do this, and this image here relates to a depiction of hominid cranial capacity changes. I'm not interested in the cranial changes, and you'll see I'll make a comment about that in a moment, but I just wanted to suggest that in terms of timelines, the way Reck wants to play out its kinky story would be to look back at these moments and perhaps look for the external drivers of the kinds of change in the environments of our forebears, to see what was actually shaping and changing their cognitive tendencies. And we would expect the story to play out along those lines in terms of how we have evolved extra additional ways of emoting of a more non-basic variety. Now, like I said, that raises a lot of questions about how exactly we should understand the relationship between the more non-basic forms of emoting, the content involving ones, and the more basic ones. Now, some bettors would say that, well, affect programs, once they're set off, cannot be stopped, but they can be masked through certain behaviors. So local norms for display rules and masking behaviors can be highly specific to the pattern practices in particular populations. If we think of it like that, that may be in fact one way that this manifests, but we are not committing ourselves to the idea that that's the only way to interfere with an interaction profile. We can take this up in further questions, but the thought might be that if you have truly adapted and modulated your capacities, you might break the patterns that are there, but in many cases that won't necessarily prove possible. And that would require some great degree of effort. So I don't want to make a blanket ruling about what's possible in this domain. I do think that's a live question for empirical science. But even if that turned out in some cases to be possible, that wouldn't destroy or devalue making of the distinction between basic and non-basic emotions. And just to pick up a last point, again, it's probably better not to use images like this. This is one that comes from Peter Goldie in response to a very early outing of this radically inactive account of the emotions, where he said it seems to commit the basic to the hard center of an avocado, where all the cultural trappings of the soft surround. But I think that's exactly not the way to think about the position that we've just put forward. Come back to the better analogy with the addition of an extra ingredient into the Coke. It changes the properties of the thing itself in some ways. It opens up new capacities and integrates with them. That doesn't mean that you can't filter that out in some cases, or that it might show manifest in this way. So I think that's a better way to capture the idea. Or to say again, we can think of this as fundamentally interactive, and think of the content involving aspects as changing dramatically those interactions, but being something that can be taken in or taken out dependent upon the cognitive context. So think of it like this: if we add a bit of beer to this Zoom session, it would have changed perhaps our interactions. Or Zoom itself is a wonderful example of how our discussion is altered by the conditions under which we're operating. So these are the kind of effects that I think on a more dynamic account of an activism, we would expect there to be possibilities and new ways of charting how the basic and non-basic motions would interact, and what differences they could have if we have contentful ways of thinking in play. Okay, so that's the core of the story. I will finish now just by saying a few basic remarks about things that we want to do to adjust our bet independently of defending the core distinction. Just as a finale, some misconceptions, but we also think terribly important ones that have made even the basic notion, when it's unadulterated, unattractive. So this is some adjustments to that basic notion so that we clear them up before we get to questions. Well, so to think of basic emotions as effect programs, for most people, is to regard them as evolutionary adaptations that are involuntarily and automatically triggered, and which result in a sequence of responses. And those patterns are what exhibit the characteristic profile for each basic emotion. As I said, we allow that that's possibly something that somebody through training or adaptation could modulate. But how should we understand BET's effect programs themselves? And here, of course, there are some standard characterizations that we now wish to resist. Colin Betty herself tells us that BET understands basic emotional responses as products of genetically determined sets of instructions called effect programs, which, once activated, generate a series of distinctive changes. Hoofendijk tells us that, quote, Ekman claims that effect programs are literally inscribed into our neural circuits. So we are not committing to either of those accounts of what an effect program is. And if we look at what Ekman himself says, he's a little bit more cautious. Effect programs are, like the emotion databases, a metaphor, for I do not think there is anything like a computer program sitting in the brain, nor do I mean to imply that the only one area of the brain directs emotion. He goes on, we know already that many areas of the brain are involved in generating emotional behavior, but until we learn more about the brain and emotion, a metaphor can serve us well in understanding our emotions. In line with other work connected with inactivism, I would push in the direction of an account of neural dynamics, much more in the vein of Anderson here. And I do think we're learning more and more about this. So I think that we can start to move beyond the metaphors of computational, reputational cognitive science. But I think, of course, that's what I would say as a radical inactivist anyway. But I think the point I'm making here simply is that that is at least compatible with the official statement, even from Ekman, on the nature of these effect programs. So my point here is simply nothing requires us to think of effect programs as brain-bound sets of instructions, not even the kind of things that Ekman said. So we have scope for that change. Thus, we need not dispense with BET or the idea of effect programs in order to view emotions as, quote, dynamically organized patterns that are realized by the whole organism. So on this, Hoofendijk and I would agree, even though we will want to retain the distinction for the reasons I stated earlier. Now, one last point is what often comes up, and in the paper we have direct quotations. People would say that the kind of radical inactive position that we defend is reduces to some form of crude behaviorism. Now, we want to resist this, and the way that we've tried to connect that up with some recent work that both Ian and I have been doing is to push this in the direction of thinking of those characteristic programmatic responses. They're probably a little stronger than just habits, because they're not something that the emotional responses aren't something that we acquire, but they are similar in the sense that we think of them as kind of open and adjustable to some extent. And so we'll make a comparison here in the finale with habits and our work on that. In the analytic philosophical literature, a habit is standardly characterized as an agent's disposition or propensity to do something in certain circumstances, a disposition acquired by having regularly done the same thing in similar circumstances in the past. Thus, if S is in the habit of phying in C, circumstances C, S is likely to phi when circumstances C obtain, as we can probably gather. Now, a long history of treating habits, both in philosophy and in psychology, pushes us in the direction of something like the Ryleyan conception of habits. Now, Ryle distinguished unintelligent and intelligent dispositions, and he held that habitual responding, has nothing to do with intelligence at all. It's mere drill. So construed, habits are mindless, mechanical, and inflexible. And this is the important point. This is the same kind of characterization given to effect programs. They're completely mindless and inflexible in every respect. We think of the similarity between effect programs and, say, habits as we think about something like the Sphex wasp behavior that just is context insensitive at a certain point, where the wasp, as everyone knows, if you leave the cricket in a certain position, it will continually drag it into its burrow. And if you place it back in that same spot, even though it's done this, it will continually fall into that routine pattern unbreakably. What we think of the habits, and perhaps in the same way the effect programs, as having a little bit more play in them, is a bit more like the habit that inactivists talk about when we talk about laying a path down while one's walking. And the path both pulls something from you and at the same time reinforces a certain way of going ahead. But these are not regimented and completely unmodifiable routines. The history of the notion of habit is one in which there is receptivity and resistance in play all the time. As Claire Carlyle puts it, quote, if we could not be modified by our actions, by others' actions, and by our environment, then these could not produce habits in us because habits are acquired. And if we were not to some degree resistant to change, we would be affected and modified continually. We would not repeat ourselves as we do through habits. And this, I think, key observation captures the fact that both habits, and I'm going to argue here by extension, effect programs, allow for some degree of adjustment, but they are fixed in their characteristic patterns all the same. So there is some movement that can influence them. And here, of course, we, in this conception of habit, we are reaching also into the heart of pragmatism. And here's Dewey, quote, repetition is in no sense the essence of habit. The essence of habit is an acquired predisposition to ways or modes of response. Habit means special sensitiveness or accessibility to certain classes of stimuli, standing predilections and aversions, rather than bare reoccurrence of specified acts. So let me just clarify before we finish. I'm not suggesting that effect programs are just habits. What we're saying is that there can be some flexibility, even though effect programs are presumably not acquired as habits are, that the flexibility in an effect program might be through training and engagement. You might be able to alter the characteristic response in certain ways, even though there might be a tendency to snap back into it. And so that's the suggestion that we want to open up about thinking about this aspect of the possibilities for engaging or adjusting these programs. And if you want to hear more about habits, I would suggest that you might have a look at this new piece in Psyche that Ian and Katsunori, who were both part of our project here in Wollongong, have just brought out, and this just came out earlier today. So it's hot off the presses. And I'd like to thank the Australian government for the funding that we've had to run this project and support Ian's PhD, and a number of colleagues, including Sean Gallagher and Jesus Ilhandran, Miguel Secondo, Orton, and Michael Kirchhoff, as well as Katsunori and Ian, have all been involved in that project. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.